Welcome to the first committee hearing of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Today we are going to hear from young Americans who are concerned about climate change and who are working to be part of the solution. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. This committee is explicitly charged with finding solutions to solve the climate crisis so that we can, quote, honor our responsibility to be good stewards of the planet for future generations. So today we're starting with the Americans who are the most affected by the climate crisis, young people who are growing up in it, who are going to bear the costs and the burdens, and who will help us find opportunities and solutions. The last time global monthly temperatures were below average was in February of 1985. That means all of our witnesses and everyone who is 34 years or younger have grown up in a world that has been forever altered by climate change. In fact, this is the first Congress with members who have grown up in the climate crisis. 6 of our colleagues were born after that last below average month. And the severity of the climate crisis this generation will have to deal with in their lifetimes depends on the actions that we take now. We have made some progress in recent years in cutting carbon pollution, but it has not been enough to stop the climate crisis. Communities across the country are feeling the impacts and bearing enormous cost here and now. When I was in science class back in the day, I didn't learn about how burning fossil fuels could change the climate. But students learn about that now. I'm Gen X, but millennials and Generation Z have grown up knowing we are in a climate crisis, and they are demanding that we address it. And I want to be clear, we need this young, vibrant, smart generation that is central to America's democracy. They work, they pay taxes, they vote. And increasingly, they are doing everything they can to solve the climate crisis. In their schools, in their houses of worship, in their communities, they are taking action. And they are demanding that elected officials do the same. Solving the climate crisis offers opportunities for them. Some of the fastest growing jobs in America are solar installers and wind turbine technicians, clean energy engineers. These are no longer the jobs of the future. They are the jobs that this generation is doing to solve the climate crisis right now. This is a transformative generation. The March for Our Lives, the People's Climate Movement, the massive student climate strikes we saw all around the world, these are movements led by young people who are demanding climate justice for their generation and the generations of young people who will come after them. 70% of young people in America say they worry about climate change. And based on the latest science from the administration's own National Climate Assessment and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they have reason to worry. Seas are rising, snowpack is melting away, and in many parts of the country, droughts are getting worse. Hot, humid heat waves are becoming more intense. We're faced with more days where people cannot safely work or play outside. And higher temperatures mean that other pollutants like ground level ozone from car exhaust will become even more damaging to our health. What is necessary to address the climate crisis is to stop carbon pollution from accumulating in the atmosphere. That requires action, urgent action, ambitious action. Every ton of carbon pollution we avoid, every new solar panel and wind turbine we bring online brings us one step closer to solving the climate change challenge. So I want all the young people who are with us here today and those who are watching at school and across the country to hear our promise. We can't afford to let you down or disappoint you. The time for rejecting climate science is over. The time for frustration and despair in the face of the climate crisis must end. This is a time for hope. This is a time for solutions. This is a time for all of us to come together, all generations, all political persuasions, for action. You all are rising to the occasion. We must rise with you. Finally, when I was preparing for this hearing, I was reminded that April 4th, today, is the anniversary of the date in 1968 when we lost one of our great spiritual and political leaders, the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King understood how powerful young people are when it comes to fighting justice, fighting for justice. In 1960, amid some of the most intense student activism of the civil rights movement, Dr. King told students at Spelman College, "Keep moving, for it may well be that the greatest song has not yet been sung, the greatest book has not yet been written, the highest mountain has not been climbed. This is your challenge." Today, solving the climate crisis is not just your challenge, it is the challenge that we all share. And this committee is dedicated to ensuring that Congress meets it with you. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing today. And I want to thank all of y'all for coming here today to share your perspective. Have the opportunity often to visit with students and go talk to college classes and high school and elementary school classes. And I remind them and I remind our kids that the decisions that we make here, just statistically, y'all have to deal with for a longer period of time than we do, right? Just looking at life expectancy, it's simple numbers. And whenever Congress comes in and starts appropriating money and adds to our $22 trillion debt and proposing legislation that would just continue adding to that, it's a debt that's going to have to be paid at some point. It's something, and it's one example of a long-term consequence that is going to adversely affect young folks, and it's going to disproportionately affect young folks. And so I want to commend every one of you for being here, for participating in your government, for recognizing the decisions that we make are going to affect you, and they're going to affect you for a longer period of time than they're going to affect people of my generation and older. I agree with some of the statements that the chair made in regard to our obligation to be good stewards of this planet and protect the environment. Not a very well-known occupation of mine for a number of years. Is I was a mountaineering instructor. I was a wilderness instructor, educator, and there were years of my life where I spent more time living outside than I did inside. Doing that job, being in the outdoors, being in the incredible environment that we have here in the United States and other countries, absolutely amazing and one of the most important parts of my life. When I came up and I started doing policy work up here in my young 20s, I was so aggravated that I didn't have the opportunity to be outside. I actually used to drive every weekend over to Miss Miller's State from April to October to go be a river guide so I can be outside again on weekends. Growing up in South Louisiana, we fish and have a very unique swamp and coastal area that it's a environment unlike anywhere else I've ever seen, and it's absolutely amazing. In fact, U.S. Fish has called it one of the most productive ecosystems on the North American continent. It's an amazing place. We need to be good stewards, and let me be clear, we need to be better stewards of our environment, of our earth, and we need to ensure that the science that we gain, the technology that we gain, that we're able to apply it into logical solutions that actually make a difference. After spending a little bit of time up here doing some policy work, I found out that, or learned a lot about what was going on in South Louisiana. Found out that we had lost about 2,000 square miles of our coast. That same coast that I made reference to earlier is one of the most productive ecosystems on the North American continent. And we immediately began working together with Republicans, Democrats, Independents. We literally got to the point to where we had environmental organizations and Lisa Jackson, who was the EPA administrator under President Obama, and energy companies all working together toward a common goal of a sustainable ecosystem and sustainable communities. And despite, at one point, death threats and other charges against me and the folks who were working on our team, we ended up putting a plan together that united everyone, a sustainability plan for the ecosystem and for the community. that ended up getting unanimous support through 4 committees and through our entire legislature. I believe we have an opportunity to make progress on this issue. I do. I think we have an opportunity to help bring down energy costs. I think we have an opportunity to truly pursue an all-of-the-above energy strategy that helps to reduce emissions. I think we have the ability to apply American innovation and know-how to reducing emissions in the United States and to being a global leader on this topic. Today, the United States spends more money on climate science and technology than any other country in the world. Are we spending these dollars in the places where we need to be spending them? Are we investing in strategies that are going to actually yield outputs and gains that help to, again, help to improve our environment, help to reduce emissions, help to bring down energy cost? Are we spending money in studying things that aren't ultimately going to yield outputs or outcomes? I'm really looking forward to hearing y'all's thoughts today. I'm really looking forward to getting your input and figuring out how we can work together to next steps to truly try to redefine this issue and stop this partisan ridiculousness that surrounds this issue and make progress that we can truly be proud of and turn over a planet, turn over an environment to my kids, to the next generation and theirs that we can all be proud of. Thank you, and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Without objection, members who wish to enter opening statements into the record may have 5 business days to do so. Now I want to welcome our witnesses. First, we have Mr. Chris Suggs, who describes himself as a speaker, activist, community leader, and entrepreneur. He hails from Kinston, North Carolina, and is a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Ms. Lindsay Cooper is a recent college graduate who served as a Louisiana Governor's Fellow while studying at Tulane. After graduation, she joined the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities as a policy analyst. Mr. Aji Piper is a plaintiff in the landmark climate change case called Juliana versus the United States. He lives in Seattle near Puget Sound. And Ms. Melanie Zhang is a climate justice coordinator at Sojourners and serves as co-chair for the steering committee of Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. She just moved to D.C. after growing up and attending school in Michigan. Without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Mr. Suggs, you are now recognized to give a 5-minute presentation of your testimony.
Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity today to testify about my personal experience with natural disasters and our nation's changing climate. My name is Chris Suggs. I'm 18 years old, and I'm a sophomore at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I'm studying political science and religious studies. I'm from Kinston, North Carolina, where I was born and raised, and my parents were born and raised. I'm here today to talk about the impacts of climate change that I've seen in my community firsthand and my personal experiences urging Congress to take action now. Kinston is a small town with just a little over 20,000 people, located in the heart of eastern North Carolina. My mom, who's here with me today, is an elementary school teacher and city councilwoman, and my father is a parks and recreation supervisor. I love my hometown, everybody knows everybody, and it's truly a great place to live. Once a bustling community with a strong economy based on textiles and tobacco, today Kinston faces a lot of economic challenges. Before I was born, lots of industries left the area, and hurricanes Fran and Floyd in the 1990s wiped out lots of businesses and damaged many of our neighborhoods. This led to disinvestment, lack of community morale, and a significant population loss. Between 1990 and 2010, Kinston lost more than 16% of its population. East Kinston was particularly hit hard. A neighborhood there known as Lincoln City was completely wiped out by Hurricane Floyd in 1999, the year before I was born. From what I've read and heard from members of my community, that hurricane was devastating. It was beyond devastating. But from what I've seen, driving down streets that were once full of homes and businesses, but now overgrown with brush and wildlife thanks to flooding and FEMA buyout programs, I know it was beyond devastating. To this day, there continues to be concentrated poverty and crime in my neighborhood, in part due to lots of abandoned structures, outdated and dense public housing, and a lack of economic development. At a very young age, my parents instilled in my siblings and I the importance of serving our community and uplifting others. That's why in October of 2014, when issues in Kinston began getting really bad, I knew I needed to make a change. Throughout 2014, gun violence became a serious issue in Kinston, especially among young people. This, combined with a 2014 study stating that my neighborhood of East Kinston was the most economically distressed census tract in the entire state of North Carolina, made me decide that enough was enough. So I decided to start my nonprofit organization, Kinston Teens Incorporated, with a mission of empowering young people through service, leadership, and civic engagement. We host youth leadership seminars, arrange college visits for high school students, work to register voters, and make sure our voices are heard at state and local government meetings. In my neighborhood of East Kinston, we launched a vacant lot transformation program to transform vacant lots into small parks, community gardens, and other community amenities. A big part of our work has been to respond to disasters like Hurricane Matthew and Florence and work to build community resilience. The thing about Kinston is that hurricanes aren't even the worst part of the storm for us. It's the catastrophic flooding that follows. Kinston sits along the banks of the Neuse River, which cuts right through our town. That river is one of our greatest natural assets, but also one of the most dangerous. It is flooded again and again, cutting off parts of our community, wiping out neighborhoods, and flooding our main business corridor along US Highway 70. As a result, my town's socioeconomic challenges cannot be divorced from the extreme weather we've experienced. Poverty and hurricanes are deeply intertwined for us in eastern North Carolina. In 2016, Hurricane Matthew hit. Following the storm, the river flood stage hit about 28.3 feet, and within 3 or 4 days, it was swamping entire apartment complexes, flooding businesses and churches, and cutting the town in half. My organization, Kinston Teens, had been in existence for about 2 years then, and we immediately sprang into action. Parts of Kinston were cut off from food access for about 25 days because of the flooding, so it took a serious community effort to make sure that our neighbors were provided with the resources to survive. It took 3 or 4 weeks for the waters to completely recede. When Hurricane Florence hit in September 2018 and caused that same level of destruction, many families, neighborhoods, and businesses were once again underwater. They were still recovering from Matthew, though. But Kinston Teens again sprang into action. We worked with our city officials and police department to go door to door, notifying people about the evacuation process, tell them where their local shelters were, and even in some cases helping people to physically evacuate. We coordinated volunteers to distribute food, groceries, and phone chargers to families in the shelters and our first responders. My community is still rebuilding from Florence, and from Matthew on top of that. And with hurricane season starting in just a few months, people in Kinston are hesitant about what might happen this year. In just my 18 and a half years on this earth, my community has experienced 2 500-year floods on top of the floods after Hurricane Floyd in 1999. For these catastrophic events to happen at such a fast rate, a rate that my community can't recover from, is deeply alarming. Climate change is an extra kick to communities and populations that are already down, especially with how often these major hurricanes and floods are occurring. My testimony is a call to action. We have to do something now to address the threat of a changing climate, reduce our impact on the environment, and mitigate the effects of these natural disasters. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share my story and my community's story. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Suggs. Ms. Cooper, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee. My name is Lindsay Cooper, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss a Louisiana perspective on climate concerns. Louisiana really is, in many respects, the perfect case study for this committee, as it grapples with a path moving forward for action in regard to climate change and its associated impacts. But before further detailing the role of Louisiana in this discussion, let me first introduce myself. I was born, raised, and educated on the North Shore of Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana. I attended Tulane University, where I majored in marine biology and public policy, and I graduated this past December. During college, I served as an environmental advocacy volunteer with No Waste NOLA, a local nonprofit seeking to reduce plastic waste throughout the city. I also interned for the Gulf Restoration Network, a local nonprofit focused on science-based coastal protection. I served as a research assistant for the Tulane Institute of Water Resources Law and Policy, and I became president of the Tulane University Green Club my sophomore year. Last year, as Chair Castor recognized earlier, I served as a Louisiana Governor's Fellow, where I had the privilege to work alongside Governor John Bel Edwards in his coastal office directly on statewide policy initiatives. It was in this time that I discovered the extent of our Louisiana coastal crisis and the imperative with which it must be addressed. Therefore, upon graduation, I joined Governor John Bel Edwards in his coastal office, where I serve as a policy analyst. I worked diligently alongside the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority to move forward policies that promote coastal wetland protection and restoration in my state. However, it did not take this experience in coastal policy to teach me about devastation from unparalleled climate threats. In states vulnerable to hurricanes, floods, and coastal degradation, my family and countless other lifelong friends have confronted devastation after devastation from these increasingly intense weather events. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, my own family had to relocate for months while our schools were closed. But many of my neighbors and friends never returned. In light of these circumstances, I'm compelled to use my education and experience to fight for the culture, people, and environment into which I was born. The Louisiana coast serves many national interests: fisheries, energy production, port, navigation, and trade activities. It provides countless ecosystem services and is home to over 2 million people. Our coastal wetlands are a key first line of defense to protect our interests and our people. Louisiana is home to approximately 30% of these national wetlands, but tragically we're losing roughly a football field's worth every hour and a half due to sediment starvation, saltwater intrusion, and erosion. In the decades to come, sea level rise will play a larger and larger role in sustainability of our coast. Our communities have not moved from the Gulf for waterfront views, but the Gulf has moved to us. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina and Rita underscored the importance of these coastal wetlands for protection of inland communities, including urban areas like the city of New Orleans, but also less densely populated areas of the Southwest. Some call us a canary in a coal mine or a harbinger of bad things soon to happen all around us. As Ranking Member Graves noted earlier, we have already lost 2,000 square miles of wetlands since 1930s, and we stand to lose much more in the years to come without significant action. To others, we're a living laboratory, a testing ground for new opportunities, and a place where community needs cutting-edge science, effective natural and man-made infrastructure, and good public policy can come together to balance interests of economy and environment. But regardless of if you take the pessimistic or optimistic view, it cannot be denied that we have all of the elements necessary to craft a large-scale solution for our country. We have a long, painful history of natural disasters and lived experience of coastal land loss. We have a strong culture of appreciation for our natural environment from a recreation and commercial point of view. And we have an economy that is deeply connected to access and utilization of energy resources. We have also found a way to deal with the impacts of our changing coast that prioritizes science-based decision-making and minimize politics. And since 2007, through our Coastal Master Plan, we have completed 111 projects across 20 of our coastal parishes. So in conclusion, as a Louisianan, I understand climate change. It's something my state lives with every day. Even as we sit here today, our Louisiana coastline is shrinking. People are migrating inland, and unique Louisiana cultures are being swept into the Gulf. So for these reasons, I ask you to consider my testimony and the urgency with which we must address this massive problem. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity to share the urgency of what we face and what I'm doing back home to help shape a better future for our coast, my state, and our nation.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. Mr. Piper, your turn. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Sorry. Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and distinguished members of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, thank you for inviting me to provide testimony. My name is Aji Piper. I'm 18 years old and one of the 21 young Americans who filed the landmark constitutional climate lawsuit, Juliana v. United States. While I am not a lawyer, nor a climate scientist, and I only recently came of voting age, I know that I have a constitutional right at stake in the actions you take. And I know from studying climate science and living with the consequences of climate change today that my health, my community, and my future, and that of my generation, is at stake. And I'm here to speak to you as a young person on the greatest issue of our time, climate change. It is the constitutional duty of the government to protect public trust resources on which we all depend, and to protect us from any damages that it may inflict upon its citizens. Instead, the government is taking actions that are directly contributing to the destruction of our planet. It is actively abusing the trust of its most vulnerable citizens, the youth. Growing up, my mom always told me that to be an adult is to take responsibility for my actions and the way that those actions impact others. She told me that to be a leader is to take responsibility for the well-being of my community and to actively work to make it safer and healthy for everyone. I took that advice to heart. I got involved in activism from an early age, planting trees with nonprofit organization. But as I got older, I began to realize that the environmental issues facing my community were much larger than could reasonably be dealt with just by planting trees. Seeing the skies of my hometown fill with smoke, seeing our snowpack diminish and our oceans become a rising threat to coastal communities and an unsafe, acidic home to shellfish in Washington, I knew that in order to fulfill my responsibility to myself and my community, I needed to broaden the scope of my civic engagement in order to truly address the issue of climate change. Like youth who have come before us in the civil rights movement and other social justice movements, it is often the young among us that shine the light on systems of injustice. And just as my federal government orchestrated systems of racial segregation in housing policies and sanctioned discrimination in schools until the middle of the last century, policies that harmed children, my federal government has also orchestrated and sanctioned a system of fossil fuel energy that is harming children in another way, that is irreversibly threatening our personal security, our health, our homes, and our communities by creating a dangerous climate system. So in 2015, 21 young people, myself included, filed a lawsuit against the United States and agencies of the executive branch to safeguard our constitutional right to a stable climate. Since then, first the Obama administration and now the Trump administration has done everything in their power to stop our case from going to trial, making unprecedented requests of the courts. And this is simply because they are scared of what trial will reveal. During the litigation, our attorneys found hundreds of documents demonstrating the United States government's knowledge of the threats of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change since 1961. In short, our government has consciously sanctioned climate destruction for more than 5 decades. And because climate change is a systemic issue, it requires systemic change to address it. The burdens of the system's problems cannot be placed on the shoulders of an individual, especially not a young person. To combat the system-wide government actions that have led to the climate crisis, we need a system-wide reform at the governmental level to address this emergency. And for this to happen, we need all 3 branches of government to act in concert. The courts need to declare our constitutional rights and mandate the standard to protect us. This branch should also recognize our constitutional rights, make legislative findings on the best science, and enact legislation not based on political will, but scientific necessity of stopping this catastrophe. The executive needs to be held accountable to the rule of law and stop promoting propaganda in support of fossil fuels and promoting lies about the climate crisis. While government may play an important role in providing for our nation's energy, housing, and schools, we don't need segregated housing and schools, and we don't need dangerous fossil energy. We need policies that don't discriminate and don't harm children. All of you took an oath to uphold our Constitution and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. In 2016, Judge Ann Aiken issued a historic opinion in our lawsuit, writing that the right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life is fundamental to a free and ordered society. And so I ask the committee, what is your plan to honor your oath and ensure my right and the rights of young people around the nation to liberty and a stable climate as mandated by the Constitution? You have a choice. Will you deprive your children and young people across the country of their fundamental right to liberty, or will you fight to protect us and our nation for posterity? What will you tell your children about responsibility if you fail to act now in the face of crisis? When you leave office, I want you to be able to walk away knowing you gave it your all, knowing you can be proud of the legacy that you leave. The moment is now. The moment is not for fear or incrementalism. This is the moment for heroism, for humanity, for standing with children around our country, standing with me. Please join your colleagues and publicly support our lawsuit. Join any future amicus curiae, thank you. I always forget how to pronounce that word. Amicus curiae briefs that members of Congress file in support of our constitutional rights and the judiciary exercising its Article 3 powers in our case. And show children everywhere you care about their future and the future of all generations to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Piper. Ms. Zhang, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you. to tell my story about how I came to care about the climate crisis as an essential part of my Christian witness. My fascination with creation began ever since I started to speak. My first words, which were in Chinese, my heart language, were 出去, which means go outside. There were seasons of my life devoted to poisonous frogs, another to Michigan birds. As a child, I was wrapped with wonder, as children often are, with the richness and diversity of wildlife that can be found in God's creation. And when things got overwhelming, I retreated to my neighborhood parks, which served as a sanctuary for myself. I still do. The practice of the presence of God in creation opens up my imagination and teaches me to listen. Speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish in the sea inform you. In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind, reads Job. The scriptures elsewhere erupt with song and mention of God's abiding love for every corner of creation. Genesis 2:15 says that the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and take care of it. In the Hebrew, these two words are avad and shamar, and they appear often elsewhere in reference to God himself watching over and protecting us. To me, it is clear that God has entrusted this great gift of creation to us with the responsibility to steward it with utmost intentionality. I love people. I can see the imago Dei, the image of God, uniquely reflected in each person I meet. I believe that Scripture could not be more clear about God's command to love our neighbors as ourselves. I see that Jesus shows us how much he really means this when he intentionally makes his home among us, seeks to draw nearest to the overlooked and the underheard, the outcast in society. He lovingly lays hands on people who have been shunned, heals them, and spends precious time with them. Then Jesus goes so far as to sacrifice himself to the point of death to reconcile to himself all things so that we may have new life. I testify that I am moved and changed by the depth of his compassion towards me and all of life on earth. I learned for the first time that our earth was out of balance in my environmental science class. As I listened to the stories of thousands of species going to extinct and how weather patterns were being hijacked by climate change, I was shaken to my core and enraged. The earth is the one home we all have, and it's God's very first and wonderful gift to us. I can barely begin to imagine how much it must hurt God's heart. I decided to continue exploring environmental issues at university. It was during this time the Flint water crisis unfolded right next to us in Michigan. I listened in utter shock and dismay as my classmates shared about their families having no choice but to drink and bathe in water lined with lead for years until the mainstream media took it up. We organized daily water bottle drives to be sent to the people in Flint, and I learned that 60% of their population was made up of people of color, and 40% were under the poverty line. In this period of my life, I began to understand more fully what environmental injustice looked like played out in real time. I was shaken at the reality of suffering I was witnessing, and my heart broke for these people, my neighbors. Congress, today I stand before you as Climate Justice Coordinator for Sojourners, a Christian advocacy organization, and I serve as a co-chair for Steering Committee of Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. After the Flint water crisis, I saw with new eyes that ecological issues are not one-off, siloed problems without consequence to people's lives. I continue to witness the upending of livelihoods that brothers and sisters are already facing, both here in our very communities and all over the world, as a direct result of the climate crisis. Just last week, historic flooding after a bomb cyclone in Nebraska killed 3 people and ravaged homes. Cyclone Idai killed 750 people and displaced 100,000 in South Africa. California wildfires last year were the deadliest, most destructive wildfires ever on record, and they killed 104 people. I encounter these stories, and I am changed. If I do nothing, I am complicit. More than this, I am disobedient. The impacts of the climate crisis are hitting our most vulnerable neighbors first, the ones Jesus loved to draw close to. People of color, women, and people living under the poverty line and the young generation are already bearing the brunt of the climate crisis while doing the least to contribute to it. No wonder why young people care. As a Christian, I believe God calls us to a total and radical reimagination and transformation of our relationship with others and the earth. As political leaders, especially ones of faith, I implore you to respond faithfully and with full force to love God and neighbor by enacting just, compassionate, and transformative climate policies which rise to the challenge of the climate crisis. And we don't have a lot of time. So I invite you to dream beyond this deep-rooted partisanship into co-creating a world of wholeness together. And to my fellow believers in the room, we live in the era of the resurrected Christ. So let us practice resurrection. We can begin to cultivate wholeness in our communities by addressing the climate crisis faithfully and with full attention. It is a fulfillment of the commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves. And that is my prayer for you. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for your passionate and insightful testimony. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. You all have given voice to the fact that climate change is one of the most urgent, complex challenges humanity has ever faced. We must wrap our heads around it. We've got to wrap our heads around the scale of the problem and the potential consequences of failing to rise to the challenge. As a result, some people react to the crisis with fear and apprehension and even despair, and those are understandable feelings, but in recognizing a crisis, Americans can rise to the occasion. We can come together to see our way to solutions. The witnesses we've just heard from have found resolve in the face of crisis and have taken action to be part of the solution. So I'd like to ask each one of you, where do you find hope and optimism in the face of such a daunting problem? Mr. Suggs, will you start?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Chair Castor. I believe that I find my most hope and my optimism in the faces of people in my community. I've seen how resilient and how responsive we've been to these natural disasters that affect us so extremely. Hearing the stories of how Hurricane Floyd in 1999, the year before I was born, devastated so much of my community, but how people immediately went back and tried to rebuild. People stayed in Kinston and started businesses and homes elsewhere in the community. They loved our community so much that they did not allow the catastrophic flooding from Floyd to overall destroy them. And then when Hurricane Matthew hit in 2016, I remember standing on a picnic table right along the banks of the Neuse River, and I and my organization, Kinston Teens, organized a prayer gathering and a volunteer rally to bring our community together. This was the day after the hurricane hit, but in the days before the flooding. And I stood on top of a picnic table. There were around 350 people surrounded me, all walks of faith, all walks of life, all races, all political parties, everything. We came together in prayer, and we immediately started volunteering, preparing sandbags, placing in front of homes and businesses, and doing whatever we can to help our community prepare for the floods. And that's where I see my optimism coming from. That's where I get my faith from, just from how resilient my community has been in spite of all the challenges.
Ms. Cooper?
I wholeheartedly agree with what Mr. Suggs said. And I think I am most hopeful when there's a vision. I was just reading the proverb on the wall that says, when there is no vision, the people perish. And in Louisiana, that's what we are really learning to embrace. I work for the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities, and I'm so encouraged just to see the plan that we have, the work that we're doing, to go to these sites, to see new barrier islands that we're building, new wetlands that we're building, and people who can live in their communities in South Louisiana because of this vision that we have. And I think a vision for Louisiana and a vision for our whole nation is so important in this way, because without that, our people will perish, and our people of Louisiana will perish as well.
But Mr. Piper, you expressed a bit more frustration in your remarks, but what do you want to see?
I would say that as the hat hasn't dropped, so to speak, on the climate crisis, we still have time to act. And so I will not feel despair because we haven't failed yet.
Ms. Zhang?
I am definitely energized by the creativity and the joy that young people bring to this movement. I was just at the climate march, the youth climate strikes a few weeks ago, and there was just a palpable joy there. And people, there was color, and there was fun, and there was a dancing part of it. And I think that's why we're sustained in our movement, is that we know when to have fun and to not make light of the issue, but really to be able to sustain us for the long run.
You know, if you want to be spurred into action, you may want to pick up the new book, The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming by David Wallace Wells. I've been reading it on the airplane going back to Florida. The author points out in the book that the majority of carbon emissions from fossil fuel combustion have occurred since Seinfeld. premiered 30 years ago in 1989, and that we have 30 years to turn it around. But I'm not sure that we have that long. The IPCC, it's concluded that we must reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050 in order to have a chance to keep warming below the significant level. So for every bit of extra warming, the world will experience more heat waves and heavy precipitation events, sea level rise, species loss. 2050 is just 31 years from now. All of you will be about our age, the age of us on the dais, and I really appreciate everything that you've said today to help spur us on to action and kick off our first hearing. With that, I'll recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to say thanks again, all of you, for being here, and I appreciate your testimony. Mr. Suggs, having been through numerous disasters, I really want to commend you for your work. One of the most uplifting things you can do is go into someone who is a disaster victim and offer them a helping hand. And it is the most important thing that you can do is just offer folks help, offer them assistance. Folks are often looking around trying to figure out where to even start. And so I really want to commend you recognizing that you were impacted by the disaster. But rather than sitting around licking your wounds, you actually lifted those up. And so thank you very much. Huge impact on communities, having been through many disasters myself. I want to ask each of you a question. One of the challenges we have here in this committee is we have to recommend actions. We have to recommend what actions the Congress should take in changing laws and policies. And there's so many things. We could probably go around this room and we could probably get hundreds of different recommendations. And so one of the things we need to do is we need to determine which of those actions actually make the most sense. Which of them are going to have the biggest impact, looking at trade-offs. Do you believe that we should apply some type of criteria to our decisions, looking at which recommendations we're making are actually going to have the biggest impact on temperature or sea rise, and also take into consideration looking at economic impacts? If, for example, one recommendation would have dire economic consequences, if there's another one that can achieve the same objective but not have as dire economic consequences, I mean, don't you think we should consider, or do you think we should consider things like that before we make recommendations? Mr. Suggs.
Thank you, Ranking Member Graves. I absolutely do believe in practicality. I believe that when it comes to policy, when it comes to legislation, when it comes to any type of action items that are taken on behalf of such a large country as the United States, we do need to think of all the logistics. We need to make sure that we're not making matters worse in any capacity. So considering the issues we faced in Kinston, for example, I do want some ambitious action to be taken, but I don't want anything to happen that may disparage my community even more or disparage another community on the other side of the country. So I definitely believe in practicality.
Thank you. Ms. Cooper, quickly, you have...
Yes, I agree. I think economic implications can be a large consequence of climate action. And so I think what is most important is working on both sides of the aisle in a nonpartisan, bipartisan manner to implement these policies that we're working towards in this committee and the ideas that we're working towards.
Thank you. Mr. Piper?
Yes, thank you for this question. I'm mostly in agreement that economics definitely must be considered.
Let me clarify the question. I'm sorry.
Yes.
When economics is one, but also just looking at the efficacy of these recommendations. If we're making a recommendation, and should we evaluate, sort of what impact it's going to actually have in terms of the environment, looking at temperature changes, looking at sea rise, and things like that. So not just economic, but actually looking at and quantifying the types of, say, benefits that these recommendations would yield. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
okay.
that makes well. I was saying that economics obviously must be considered, but I think more importantly, recommendations must be made following science and what scientists say is needed to protect the natural resources and to avoid dangerous effects of climate change. And I think that is that definitely must be considered when making recommendations.
Thank you. Mr. Piper, I actually ask you one other question. I read through all of your testimony. That was long. I want to make sure I understand one thing about your recommendations. As you know, under Paris, there were targets that were established under previous administration. Do you believe those targets are appropriate, or do you think that no, you don't?
No, those.
No.
So, the targets in Paris, the 1.5 degree Celsius global warming kind of cap that they have, will actually lead to catastrophic disaster. And so we cannot hold those as a standard if we are to take any actual action on climate change. So while it may seem like they are a really radical or positive kind of caps or targets, they are not as
Aggressive.
aggressive as
And
they
so-
need to be.
And so, fair to say, your perspective that you wouldn't support Paris targets because you think they should be more aggressive than Paris.
Yes, but I still recognize that it's a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Ms. Zhang, I apologize, but very quickly, if you could respond.
Absolutely. I believe as Christians, we're called to bold and compassionate action. And sometimes, that takes courage. I know that solar energy already employs more than coal, oil, and natural gas combined. So it's definitely not either or, but it can be both and. And so it's a boost for the economy. And 70% of the American public are concerned or very, very concerned about climate change. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, and thank you to all of our witnesses. And I also want to especially welcome the other students and children who are here at this hearing today. I represent a district in Oregon, and in the Pacific Northwest, we know climate change is not a distant threat. It's reality. We've had smoke from wildfires. We have acidic oceans that are threatening the shellfish industry, decreased snowpack, limiting access to skiing and snowboarding, and that's affecting our outdoor recreation industry. Droughts and extreme weather patterns affect our agriculture community. We're concerned about warmer temperatures in the Columbia River, further endangering salmon, and rising sea levels, of course, on our coast, threaten homeowners and small businesses. So the science is clear, and the consequences for continued inaction are serious. And we've talked a little bit about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, and then, of course, the Fourth National Climate Assessment. Some people say those were wake-up calls. They're more than that. They're alarming. I'm glad we're starting this committee's work by highlighting the efforts of young leaders across the country, reaffirming the urgency of taking action. And Mr. Piper, thank you for your leadership on the Juliana case to hold the federal government responsible for failing to act on climate change. I know that one of your advisors is Dr. James Hansen. And when we're talking about, Chair Castor mentioned something about 30 years, Dr. Hansen testified. He's one of the first experts to testify in Congress about climate change. And the year was 1988. It could have been in this room because this is a science committee room, and he was with NASA at the time. I remember 1988 well because that's the year my son was born. He's now 30. So when we look at when the first testimony was here in the U.S. House, and 30 years have passed, and so I think it's a lesson for us that we must heed the call. And so I'm inspired by your work and your advocacy, especially Mr. Piper in my home state of Oregon, where of course the case is filed. You noted that the district court found the right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life is fundamental to a free and ordered society. That's from the opinion, district court opinion. And a stable climate system is quite literally the foundation of society. So you mentioned in your testimony that it should be the responsibility of all three branches of government, not just relying on the court. So can you expand a little bit about that? Why should, if the case is pending in the courts, why shouldn't we let the courts decide? Why should we take action in Congress?
So the courts don't make the laws, and I first, actually, sorry, I want to thank you for the question.
Okay.
Right? But the courts don't make the laws,
Right.
and they interpret the laws, and they, but we need laws and policy to be made in order to move forward on this. And so while in the courts, what we're asking the courts to do is recognize our rights and see the Constitution demands that our rights be protected and that laws need to be made. Ultimately, the laws need to be made by the legislative branch.
Of course, right. Thank you. And certainly understand that and know that that is our responsibility here on the Select Committee. We're going to be working with several of the committees in making sure that we get the best policy. Mr. Suggs, you said that East Kinston is a low-income, predominantly black neighborhood, and the effects of natural disasters exacerbated by climate change are often compounded with limited access to food, hospitals, medical supplies. So it's really inspiring to hear about your work. What can we do at the federal level to support vulnerable communities like yours to help you prepare and cope with the effects of climate change?
Thank you so much, Ms. Bonamici. I believe that there's so many different approaches we can take. One, definitely addressing the human impact on the environment, reducing emissions and things of that sort. But also doing things on a more local and really immediate level, implementing some flood mitigation efforts, because there are so many communities and neighborhoods like mine that are located in low-lying areas along the banks of rivers and along the outer banks of North Carolina that could use some efforts to mitigate the floods, to prevent our rivers and banks from overflowing. So there are so many efforts that can be taken when it comes to that approach as well. Then also investing in economic development and education to help empower the people in those communities to come up with solutions themselves as well, because it's a multiple way approach that I believe could really make a difference in our community.
Thank you so much. And I want to again thank all the witnesses who are here. When I think back to that year, 1988, when James Hansen, NASA scientist, was here testifying about climate change, let us not think about the future and looking back and saying they did nothing. Let this be the time that we take action. Let this be the year, let this be the Congress when we heed that call, because it is about your future. It's about the future of the next generation and the generations to come. So thank you for your leadership, Chair Castor, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Miller, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. As many of you may be aware, my home state of West Virginia is abundant in natural resources. Coal and natural gas from West Virginia help fuel the world and create good-paying jobs for my constituents. I have seen the devastation that a top-down, one-size-fits-all government approach can cause. We saw this with the war on coal from the Obama administration. The decimation of the coal industry in my state ravished our economy, particularly in the southern part of the state. It created great hopelessness and ultimately led to the rise in our opioid crisis. My district is slowly recovering. The heavy hand of the federal government has consequences, and it can ruin communities. This is why I want to empower our state and local governments, as well as our communities, as we seek to find solutions and policies for our environment. Ms. Cooper, given your experience in state government, what are some of the policies and regulations on the federal level that make it difficult to start and complete restoration projects?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Miller. I think on the state level with our coastal protection and restoration that we're doing in Louisiana, we have a whole agency that just is dedicated to this with state-of-the-art coastal scientists, modeling systems, and engineers that are working on this issue. But I think a problem that we face a lot is in permitting on the federal level and with funding. Those would be two of our main problems. Funding in that we don't receive all of the money from offshore oil that we would like to fund our restoration projects. And then on the permitting side, these processes are long and arduous and they take years to get through. And when we're trying to restore the environment, it's challenging to wait this long because the wetlands continue to degrade more and more as we wait in these permitting processes and as this takes longer. So if we can get that done faster, then we can restore even more wetlands.
So removing some of the red tape is what you're saying, in
Yes.
essence?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what are some of the ways the federal government can be a better partner to help our state and local governments?
Mm-hmm. As I mentioned with the offshore revenue sharing, we are a part of this partnership called GOMESA, funding from offshore revenue that happens from the Gulf Coast. And we are responsible for a large portion of the offshore oil and revenues that come to the federal government. And I think if we were allocated our proper amount in that, we'd be able to fund more restoration projects that we're working on.
Okay, thank you. And what are some best practices in your experience that the state of Louisiana has implemented to preserve the environment without costing jobs in the energy industry?
Right, so as you know, coming from West Virginia, our economy as well is heavily reliant on the industry that surrounds us. So we find it most successful to partner with the industries that we're working with. We receive a lot of our funding from state mineral revenues, from offshore oil, like I had mentioned, and from oil spill compensations. And so we find this partnership works best for us because we couldn't do restoration on the scale that we do without receiving the funding that we do through these programs. So I think developing those partnerships and learning to work in a compromising manner is really the only way that we can provide long-term solutions to this problem.
And you're using innovation in that equation as well?
Yes, definitely.
All right, thank you so much. Madam Chair, I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Huffman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, for bringing these young leaders as our first hearing of this Select Committee to remind us that we are dealing with a crisis. If you believe that we have the luxury of time, if you believe that we have the luxury of incrementalism, I would submit that you're in the wrong room and probably in the wrong century. Just last month, I joined students at Casa Grande High School in Petaluma, in my district, in a climate walkout. First time I've ever encouraged kids who were skipping school. But they were engaging in civil disobedience, or what our colleague Congressman John Lewis might call good trouble. And the reason why is very clear. There comes a time when there's an issue and a cause that is so important that you have to engage in some unconventional tactics. And the climate crisis is that issue. All over the country, all over the world, young people are finding their voices on climate change. And I thank the witnesses today for offering their voices and calling on those of us in office to heed that call. This level of engagement and activism is one of the best things that I have seen in my many years of beating my head against the wall on this issue. And trust me, I've been at it for a while. Just as the youth of the 1960s became the fulcrum of change for ending segregation, for civil rights, for voting rights, I think the students who led this walkout and the students who are here and the young people who are here today are motivated by the need to address climate change and its impacts in a way that's very similar. It reminds me, reminiscent of the 1960s and the civil rights movement. You're focused on the loss of coral reefs, sea level rise that will endanger coastal communities worldwide, food shortages, and many other catastrophic impacts of climate change. And don't let anyone tell you that your demand to have a livable planet for your lifetime and for your children is unreasonable or extreme or radical. It's really not. It's essential that we hear your voice. For the many students in my district, this is deeply personal. Their communities are still recovering from wildfires that were the deadliest and most costly in our state's history, a situation that will only get worse with climate change. Last year, California's fourth climate change assessment found wildfires larger than 25,000 acres could become 50% more frequent if we fail to act. So you are calling for swift action to stop climate change, and that's the right message, and I believe you're the right messengers. But I know that when young people call for change, they're often ridiculed and dismissed as being unreasonable. They're urged to think incrementally. That might have been the right conversation a few decades ago, and it was over 4 decades ago in 1981, just down the hall in this very building, one of the first congressional hearings on climate change was held. Ms. Bonamici referenced a 1988 hearing with Dr. James Hansen. Well, in 1981, a congressman named Al Gore held a hearing on this subject. And don't you wish that we could go back in time and tell the members of Congress in that room and tell the world that was tuning into that hearing, listen to this man, he is right. In just a few decades, we're going to start losing our coral reefs. We're going to have several multi-billion-dollar extreme weather catastrophes a year in this country. This is a real crisis, and you don't have the luxury of time. So we can't go back in time, unfortunately, and speak to the Congress of 1981 or the people of 1981. As the saying goes, the best time to plant a tree is 10 years ago. right? But the next best time to plant a tree is right now. And we need to plant a lot of trees very quickly. So the good news is today you are speaking to the United States Congress. And some folks are tuning in, I hope, on C-SPAN, which Al Gore helped to create, by the way. So do you have a final word or sentence to this moment for the members of Congress who are listening, for the folks who are tuned in on Al Gore's C-SPAN, that hopefully are listening this time and understand the urgency? I open it up to any of you to speak to that.
So I appreciate your statement and your question as well. I think in Louisiana, we see the detrimental impacts of a changing climate like none other. And anyone can see that, regardless of what political party you are, regardless of what industry you work in. Mm-hmm. Everyone can see that. All the communities that we're working with, all of the people, and even at a federal level, you can see the coast of Louisiana degrading. And I think what I would emphasize to Congress is compromise. Mm-hmm. Put aside our partisanship on this.
Can I follow up on that? Would you indulge
yes.
the shortest of questions? I know I'm beyond my time, but Ms. Cooper.
Yes.
I am very moved by your passion for preventing the impacts and addressing the resiliency needs of the Louisiana
mm-hmm.
coast. To you and Mr. Graves, who's a real champion on this, please tell the folks back home that he's constantly mm-hmm. beating this drum. My answer is yes, let's do it. Mm-hmm. Let's act boldly to preserve your coastline mm-hmm. and to build your coastal resiliency. But wouldn't you agree that at the same time as we do those things, if we are making the climate warmer by failing to address emissions, mm-hmm. we're not really helping you? Would you agree with me on that?
I would, but I believe that it's all about compromise. I don't think it has to be 0% oil and gas or 100% oil and gas. I think what we need is a gradual transition. We need technological innovation that keeps pace with our transition away from oil and natural gas. I don't think it can happen overnight. In Louisiana, too much of our jobs and our livelihood and economy is dependent on this. And so I stand firmly behind
I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And I'd like to welcome Congresswoman Mary Scanlon of Pennsylvania for joining us today and sitting in. So welcome. Now, Mr. Armstrong, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks to everyone sitting here. We have a big close-up group program in North Dakota, and our high school kids are out here over the course of the last 3 weeks. And my favorite thing in the entire time I'm in this town is when I see young people becoming engaged in things, whether I agree with them, disagree with them, or anything. I think it's fantastic. I think you bring a perspective that we oftentimes lack hearing from when we are in this town. And so as we go through this, I am from North Dakota. We have we produce the world's food, we produce the world's energy. So trying to figure out how you want to make sure that we keep these competing interests at play is sometimes interesting. So I called the smartest kid I know, who I used to coach as a 12-year-old in baseball, and he submitted a letter, which when I'm done, I'm going to ask for unanimous consent to put in the record, but I know I don't always read those, so I am going to read, we will get you one. So I'm just going to read the letter from my good friend Tanner Hopfoff. Dear Congressman Armstrong, I am writing to share my input in response to the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis announced hearing entitled Generation Climate, Young Leaders Urge Climate Action Now. The hearing is described as a contrast to a typical congressional hearing. The committee will hear from young leaders who are urging policy leaders to take climate action now and finally address climate crisis. I work in the oil and gas industry in North Dakota, and I consider myself a young leader who would be directly impacted by climate action being discussed in Congress. This is a complex issue, so I hope the committee will consider my perspective, which is shared by many young leaders throughout the country who may not be represented at the hearing today. I grew up in southwestern North Dakota in the rural town of Dickinson. I attended K through 12 here and graduated from Dickinson High School in May of 2014. While in high school, I decided I wanted to pursue a degree in engineering with the increase in activity and opportunities presented by the oil and gas industry, I knew petroleum engineering was my goal. Once I learned that the University of North Dakota offered a bachelor's degree in petroleum engineering, I applied and was accepted. While attending UND, I was fortunate enough to have an internship during each of the 3 summers, 2 of which were in western North Dakota. Upon graduating in 2018, I accepted a position with an exploration and production company and have been there since. My career thus far and educational decisions would have been drastically different were it not for the oil and gas industry in my community. My story is not unique. Before the oil and gas industry became established, many young adults from rural North Dakota were forced to look for jobs and career opportunities out of state after graduating. Simply put, the jobs that offered long-term career advancement that would appeal to young adults entering the workforce did not exist in North Dakota. As a result, our rural communities were shrinking and we're losing our small-town culture and way of life so many had enjoyed for generations. The oil and gas industry has completely changed this outlook. Local citizens now have the opportunity to go to work and have careers in the areas they have always called home. This industry has provided a spark to our communities and has given a breath of life back to them. Communities that have been shrinking for many years have now begun to grow and prosper. People are choosing to move and live in rural North Dakota because of the careers that are now available. Additionally, local residents now have the ability to remain in their hometown while having successful and meaningful careers. The boom in the economy has provided so much for the individuals that are working directly in the industry, but it has also positively influenced the way of life for all citizens living in the area and even in the entire state. Rural citizens have benefited from increased infrastructure, advancing education systems, and additional sources of entertainment. So many things that rural North Dakotans would have never thought possible or to be available in their communities now are available because of this industry. The oil and gas industry is reshaping North Dakota and the economy at the local and the state level. The industry has put North Dakota on the map and continues to provide many opportunities for rural North Dakotans. Without this industry, our economies would cease to grow, job opportunities would no longer be abundant, and once again, local citizens would be forced to look out of state for career opportunities. I stand behind the oil and gas industry and will continue to support its involvement in the rural North Dakota communities. I'm proud to have grown up in western North Dakota. I am proud to have graduated from college in eastern North Dakota, and I am proud to be an active member of the workforce that the industry has established in North Dakota. The oil and gas industry in North Dakota has revolutionized the way we extract oil and gas from the land and has an incredible record of post-production reclamation. We live where we work, and we take our environmental stewardship very seriously. And there's another paragraph, but in the interest of time, I just ask for unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Caston, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for putting this hearing together, and thank you to all our witnesses. You know, we always start off these things by thanking witnesses, and there's just sort of a pro forma to that, and somehow it seems insufficient for you guys today. You deserve more than just thanks. You know, as a lot of people have said up here over the last 4 decades, we've had a bipartisan consensus to do nothing. And that's shameful. That's bipartisan agreement, but it's an agreement for inaction, at least on the scale that's required. Now, some of that actions may be driven by corruption, some is driven by denial, some is driven by cowardice, but I think in all cases, there are far too many in this town who are content to sit and wait for public opinion to force them to act. And acting in response to polls may make you an effective politician, but it is the opposite of leadership. What you all have done in getting to this point is leadership. You're shaping public opinion. You're forcing people to mobilize for the greater good, even if that is contrary to their own individual interests. And that's worth more than just a pro forma thanks. So thank you for being here and for driving that conversation. What you've done is leadership distilled, and what we've done so far is shameful. Now, as Mr. Piper noted, this is a first step. It's a small first step, but all of us on both sides of this dais, as Robert Frost said, we have promises to keep and miles to go before we sleep. So let's hold us accountable to those promises. Let's hold you accountable for those promises, and start thinking about what the next steps are. As we all think about those, I want to start just with a little bit of advice for you all. I've spent my entire career trying to do something about climate change, first as a scientist, then as an engineer, then as an entrepreneur, built a couple companies, Everything I ever did was built on profitably reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I used to think that dealing with climate change was a technology problem. The laws of thermodynamics were somehow holding us back. Then I thought it was an economic problem, that the laws of economics were somehow holding us back. And I'm in this job now because I've come to the conclusion that it's the laws of the United States that are holding us back. Now, the good news is that's the only one of those laws that can be changed. So that's a cause for some optimism, but it took me about 20 years to come to that realization. And if you'll humor me with some advice, it's only to hope that you can be smarter than I've been. My first piece of advice for you is do not waste your energy preaching to the converted. It's good for your ego. It'll make you feel good. It's not necessary. Number two, do not waste your energy celebrating those who agree that climate change is real. They deserve no more praise than people who will acknowledge that their tinfoil hat does not prevent the aliens from reading their thoughts. So what do? Lead not by persuading people who already are there. Lead not by telling people they're immoral, but lead by getting people to understand that their self-interests are aligned with your larger purpose. People who are motivated solely by economics like to not pay for fuel. People who are motivated solely by national security like the idea that we could have a military that doesn't depend on sending money to people we don't feel very good about. People who are motivated, they feel macho by getting behind the wheel of a really fast muscle car, love the acceleration of an electric vehicle. Meet people where they are and get them to go. And so my question for you all who have done a better job of leadership than we have is to maybe share in the few minutes we have left how you have persuaded people who disagree with you to act for the greater good and what we can learn from your experience. Mr. Suggs.
I'll start. Thank you, Mr. Caston. I will share that I believe sharing stories is one way to really build bridges. And when I have opportunities to share the stories that are from my community, how people's lives have been just totally changed by these catastrophic events, I believe that's a way to build rapport among each other, and we see where we're coming from. And when I can hear the stories of, like the gentleman from North Dakota just shared about the young man who works in the oil and gas industry, and we can hear those stories, and I believe that's the path that we use to find compromise. So, but when we can share stories, I believe that's the way to really persuade people to hear the other perspective.
I appreciate your advice, Congressman Caston. And I find that it's important in this instance to have shared experiences. In Louisiana, I get to see this on a personal level, which I'm very privileged by, but to see individuals and communities, as I had briefly noted before, that are losing their cultures, that are losing their environments every day already to these climate crises. And we can all see the impacts of intense weather events in our communities. And if not in our communities, then we can see this on national television. It's everywhere. We have disasters happening all the time. And I think relating to one another in that shared experience manner is the best way to move forward, because you can't deny that those things are happening.
I think out of respect to my colleagues, I think we're out of time, but I appreciate your responses, and sorry to not leave time for all of you.
Thank you, and I want to explain. Chair Castor and Representative Han had to run to another committee where they're having votes on amendments and bills, so they will return. And at present, I would like to recognize Representative Levin for 5 minutes for your questions.
Well, thank you so much. So grateful for finally the first hearing of this select committee, grateful to serve, and really grateful to all of you. I think my friend Mr. Casson said it well. You give us hope, and we're grateful that you're here. I think the work of this committee is significantly overdue. This is a scientific, health, political, economic, national security, environmental, and moral issue. My constituents in Southern California feel the impact of climate change every day in many different ways: increased coastal erosion that has caused infrastructure to collapse, sea level rise, longer and more extreme droughts, and unprecedented wildfires. These examples are underpinned by clear and compelling evidence, including from institutions in my district like the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And they reinforce the stories that we've heard from you, both in your written testimony and here this morning. I have no doubt
that what we continue to highlight here will just add to the overwhelming evidence that we better transition away to a more sustainable future, but we better do so in an economically productive way. And what I mean by that, like Mr. Caston, I've been in the clean energy industry for about 15 years. And it's an incredible economic opportunity, and we cannot lose sight of that. And it should be shared by all regions of this country, especially those that have been dependent on fossil fuels. As far as the heavy hand of the federal government, I'd like to remind my colleagues of the tens of billions of dollars that we subsidize fossil fuels with each year. The real question in my mind is whether Americans will be using clean energy technologies that are developed here, that are researched, developed, deployed here with American jobs and American ingenuity, or whether we're going to be using technologies that are developed and deployed first in Asia and Europe, and whether we're going to lead or whether we're going to cede our global leadership. So I commend you all for your leadership. It was a similar belief in the need to act on climate that prompted my own campaign for Congress after working as an environmental activist and lawyer for about 15 years, as I mentioned. And I actually began my campaign by sending my opponent a copy of the book Climate Change for Beginners, which is written at about a third grade reading level. Everybody here should check it out. If you have a family member that doesn't believe in basic science, hand it to them. But the reality is that our president also denies the scientific consensus on climate. When he visited my home state of California last year in the wake of our devastating wildfires, he suggested we rake our forests, that would solve the problem. So, Mr. Piper, I wanted to turn to you. How would you respond to this current administration's omissions and outright denial of science?
Thank you for the question, and I sued them.
Well, that's... Care to opine on that, sir?
I'd like to clarify for the record, you actually sued the Obama administration.
That's true. That's true.
Please do clarify for the record, Mr. Piper. Don't worry about that. They're voting down the way.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. On a less humorous note and a more serious note, I think it's hard to honestly hold a response to such strong, illogical climate denial because there's not much you can say. Something as ridiculous as telling somebody to rake a forest in order to reduce the effects of a wildfire season that is out of our control, it blows my mind. But I guess in like honestly, when I think about how I respond to that, it would have to be that I place my faith in the proceedings of the court, in the hope that the court can disregard the disbelief, recognize the science and the constitutional obligation and the constitutional rights of the youth, not only my co-witnesses here, but also all the youth across America, to a livable climate and a stable future.
And I was very interested, Mr. Piper, to see that your case highlights some of the federal subsidies for fossil fuels. Can you briefly expand on the role that these fossil fuel subsidies play in your case?
Ooh. At the moment, like right now, I don't have that off the top of my head, but I'm actually happy to get back to you with that.
That would be great. Finally, if I could just run just a second or two longer, Mr. Suggs, can you talk about how the repeated flooding has affected Kinston's economy, small businesses, the workers who rely on wages from those businesses?
Thank you, Congressman Levin. I will say, I mentioned it earlier in my testimony how U.S. Highway 70 runs right through town. It's our main business corridor. It also runs almost parallel with the Neuse River. So many of our businesses are located along that highway. If you want to get from our state capital, Raleigh, to North Carolina's beautiful beaches, you have to go down Highway 70 in Kinston. And when hurricanes and floods hit, that entire highway is flooded. So many of the businesses along that highway, grocery stores, restaurants, clothing stores, are all underwater and submerged. People are out of work for weeks or months while these businesses have to rebuild. North Kinston in eastern North Carolina is also big on agriculture, and you have farms and migrant farm workers and their families and the farmers' families who are out of work for months while their farmlands are underwater. So it definitely is takes a huge toll on our economy. People sometimes leave our community because of the constant flooding. So that also affects population loss, and that has a trickle-down effect on the economy. So there's so many ways it affects.
Thank you, Mr. Suggs. To the extent that we consider the economic impacts of climate change, let's be fair and even-handed about those impacts, and I yield back. Thank you.
Ms. Brownlee, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for having this hearing, our first major hearing today. I can think of no better group of witnesses to kick off this committee than the young leader sitting before us today. You represent, as many of us have already expressed, but you represent the generation that will bear the full brunt of the failures of our generation and previous generations to prevent this crisis if we do not act. I must say I'm heartened that even in despite of the federal government's inaction, that all of you have expressed hope and still believe that the government can, in a non-political way, truly and boldly address this climate crisis. So there's no question that the time to act is now, and I am proud to represent a district in California, and I believe this committee has a historic opportunity to learn from California's example and many other solutions that we can find nationwide and, quite frankly, worldwide. There's so many questions that I'd like to ask all of you, but I know my time is limited. But Mr. Piper, I am just so extraordinarily impressed. As you said, you sued the government, and very impressed that you were able to pull that together. And I understand that your lawsuit, there were 21 plaintiffs that were 21 years or younger. I can't imagine your joy and your feeling of success when the judge held that your argument that you have a due process right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life. It must have been an extraordinary moment, and the disappointment still continues that the case has not been fully resolved. But you talk about this issue, we talk a lot about the climate crisis with regards to its economic impact, to its health impact, to its national security impact, but you're really describing this, quite frankly, as a civil rights, fundamentally a civil rights issue. And so I wanted to ask you first if you were intentional in terms of having 21 plaintiffs that were 21 years or younger, and if so, why? But I also wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about your belief in why the climate crisis is so much a civil rights issue to our time.
Thank you, Mrs. Brownlee, for this question. In regards to the ages and number of the plaintiffs, I believe it's just coincidence of fate, not necessarily something that's specific and intentional. And then with it being, oh my, I honestly forgot the second part of your question. Could you please?
So just you've talked about the climate crisis being a civil rights issue. And, you know, if you could just talk a little bit more about that, I'd like to hear the other panelists sort of weigh in on what their feelings are that this climate crisis is indeed a civil rights issue of our time.
Yeah. So I think it's the easiest way to say this is the public trust doctrine, which is in common law, states that the government holds a responsibility to protect the natural resources of the air, land, and the water for posterity. And when we recognize that no life on this planet can be held without those three natural resources, without having clean air, clean water, and land that is capable of sustaining life and growing life. And then specifically in regards to our Constitution, I believe it is the Fifth Amendment that says that the federal government cannot deprive its citizens of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or property without due process of law. And in that way, we have to recognize that the federal government's destruction of the environment through its conscious building of a fossil fuel infrastructure is a violation of the Constitution.
Thank you.
Thank you. 5 minutes goes by
Yes.
quickly.
And
Thank you very
votes have
much,
been
and I
called
yield
on the,
back.
thank you. Votes have been called on the floor, but we're going to try to. We're still in recess. Oh, excuse me, we are in recess. Okay, good. I was going to counsel everyone to be concise, but now I think we're okay. But so, Mr. Palmer, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Ms. Cooper, you talked about some of the issues involving Louisiana, and I know the focus is entirely on human activity and what the government ought to do in regard to human activity. Louisiana's been involved in some major floods, one a couple of years ago that caused tremendous damage. And there's a lot of discussion about what the federal government's responsibility is in that. Isn't it true that the Army Corps of Engineers had a study that lasted 20-something years, maybe 30 years, looking at building a diversion canal from the Comey River over to the Lily Basin that would largely have mitigated any problem from that flood, or at least made the problem much more minimal than they were? Are you aware of that? Can you talk about it a little bit?
Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Palmer. I am not familiar specifically with that project. I can get back with you on the information needed afterwards. But I can speak to how our restoration projects and the projects that we're doing are all aimed at reducing flood risk for our communities. And I'm sure, as you might have seen, we have flood maps for our entire coast, and we're trying to figure out where the biggest flood risks are now and in the next 50 years. We set up like a low and a high scenario of what could be the lowest expectations and the highest. And so we're trying to plan our projects around that information. And so we're putting projects in areas that need it the most and making our investments worth the most. But in regard to that specific project, I'd be glad to get back with you on that.
Well, you don't need to, because I know a good bit about it. I wanted to know what you know about it. And the issue here is that I know the climate's changing. Climate has a history. It's always been changing, and there's some serious consequences from climate change that we need to be prepared for. I worked for 2 international engineering companies. I worked in environmental systems, ran a think tank for 25 years. And there's a fundamental principle in addressing issues, and that is you first have to properly define the problem. If you don't properly define the problem, then the solutions you come up with generally are going to be off the mark. And there are very serious consequences when dealing with climate change if we don't properly define the problem. If you put all the emphasis on anthropomorphic impact and you don't take into account natural variation and other issues, then we are going to suffer. For instance, there's an ice shelf in the Antarctic. Are y'all familiar with the ice shelf? That there's some concerns about it. I see Mr. Piper's nodding his head. The last time that ice shelf broke off was 125,000 years ago. Okay, any idea why it broke off? Some folks think it was climate change, and there's a high probability that that was part of it, because we've gone through cooling periods and warming periods. But it's also highly probable that it's basic physics, because an ice shelf is not an iceberg. It's not displacing its mass in water. It's not an ice sheet on land. It extends out over the surface of the water. In this particular case, it's probably 5 or 6 feet above the water. And at some point, just basic physics are going to come into play where the weight on the end will cause it to break off, and it will, if it doesn't freeze back in place, whatever it does, once it hits the water, it's going to cause sea levels to rise. If we don't take into account the natural variations and that climate is changing and take action to mitigate for those probabilities, as they failed to do in Louisiana with the Comet River Canal, then you're going to have some serious problems. If we'd built that canal 30 years ago, and Mr. Graves and I have talked about this quite a bit, I think you wouldn't have had the billions and billions of dollars in damage. You probably wouldn't have had the loss of life and the destruction that you had. So my encouragement is for you to stay involved, but look at the total picture. Don't focus on just one thing. And with that, Madam Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Mr. Lujan, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, good morning, everyone. And again, thank you to all of our witnesses today for your testimony, for the courage to be here today and what you're doing with your lives to make a positive difference, not just in our communities, but really having a positive impact around the world. Each of you has made the case that it's past time for Congress to act to protect the health and safety of our young people and our earth, and I applaud your efforts. We agree with you. Most of us agree with you. I'm going to start off my remarks today by sharing a little data and a little bit about my age. In 1990, I was 18 years old. In the 29 years since, we've seen the impacts of climate change. To begin in the nearly 3 decades since I was the age of some of our guests here today, nearly half the industrial emissions that have ever been emitted into the atmosphere for the entirety of human history have been released. It's had a dramatic impact on our world. The polar caps then were 40% larger. Our seas were about 3 inches lower. Our entire planet has warmed, and we've seen a new wave of biological extinctions, famine, natural disasters, negative human health. That's how I define the problem. I would say that this requires immediate action. Our changing planet affects our health, our food, our ecosystems, and our way of life, and we cannot wait for another generation to act. Ms. Zhang, I appreciate how your testimony ties environmental issues with issues of injustice. In Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si', he stressed the importance of protecting our most vulnerable from the impacts of climate change. He says, I quote, "We are faced not with 2 separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental." The Pope goes on to recognize that we have a moral obligation to act on climate change for future generations and to protect the poor, marginalized, and those most at risk. So my question for you is, can you speak to why the religious community believes we need to reduce emissions, reduce pollution, and address climate change?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Lujan, for your question. I believe that the Bible says a good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. And I think this inheritance in terms of both abundance of natural and fiscal resources, I think that I believe that God is speaking a new word through our generation. And I think that the religious community cares a lot about this because it is directly tied to our love of God and neighbor. And we see that this is a humanitarian crisis that is not something hypothetical and is happening in the future, but is already impacting people, people who Jesus called us to draw closest to, and he himself modeled that for us. And so that is some of the work that my organizations, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, and Sojourners, a Christian advocacy organization focused on transformation through a biblical call to social justice. That's the work that we do. You know, we are called to steward the very first gift that we are given by God. And this is something that God cares a lot about. And if we take the time to know the creatures on earth and to spend time in it, I think that is in the knowing really is where the loving begins. And I think we are so disconnected as a society now to that original calling that it really it starts from a practice of stewardship and a practice of of a personal experience with Earth. And so that's what we hope to do. I'm in the room with Interfaith Power and a Light, and there are numerous interreligious organizations that are working for this. So thank you.
And based on some of the earlier line of questioning, I have a simple question to each of you, which is really yes or no. Do you think that we should be doing everything we can to reduce pollution? Mr. Suggs?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Cooper?
Yes, I agree.
Mr. Piper?
Definitely.
Ms. Zhang?
Absolutely.
Well, and I hope that we don't lose sight of our responsibilities here as we look to find common ground to get this done, but we need to act. And I think that Mr. Huffman has highlighted the cost of inaction. And I hope that you all take to heart the importance of highlighting what happens if we don't do anything. This Congress needs to act. I mean, in the call for bipartisanship, you're not saying sit idly by and wait another 10 years to do something. I think, Ms. Cooper, you would even say it's time to act, come together, find some common ground, and get to work. Would that be correct?
That's absolutely
I appreciate that. I have to run down to a vote, and I'll see you all a little bit later. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Lujan. I now recognize Mr. Neguse for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And I also want to thank Chairwoman Castor, who I know had to step out, but for her leadership and in particular for setting the agenda of this committee to have the young folks that have joined us today be our very first witnesses with respect to our first substantive meeting. Certainly appreciate her leadership. And I want to thank each and every one of you, as my colleague, Mr. Kinston, mentioned, not in a pro forma way. I mean, I know that you all have traveled at great expense to Washington, D.C. to come visit with us today, and just know that your testimony is incredibly powerful, and it certainly is inspiring to us and to the country. Climate change is the existential threat of our time that we must begin addressing immediately. And it shouldn't be a partisan issue. As Congress discusses the threat of climate change, we cannot lose sight of what is truly at stake. The conversations we have now, the decisions that we make today, will decide the quality of life for the witnesses that are gathered here today in front of this committee. We must choose to protect their access to clean air, clean water, and a stable climate. And this is not an abstract issue, as has clearly been demonstrated today during the hearing. Climate change is staring us right in the face. In my home state of Colorado, I represent Colorado's 2nd Congressional District, Boulder, Fort Collins, northern Colorado. Over 50% of the district I represent consists of public lands. And so my constituents are already beginning to experience firsthand the impacts of this crisis. Increased flooding, erosion, rising temperatures, and faster snowmelt all have real-life consequences to my constituents. But addressing these impacts starts with an acceptance of science. And with great respect to my colleague on the other side of the aisle with respect to his comment regarding defining the problem, I don't know that this committee needs to necessarily define the problem. The scientists, the experts have defined the problem for us. The IPCC determined that we have 12 years to ensure that the increase in global temperature remains below the threshold required to avoid the most severe impacts of climate change. Let me just give you a sense of some of the key findings of the IPCC report. That carbon dioxide is at an unprecedented level not seen for at least the last 800,000 years. That sea level is set to continue to rise at a faster rate than over the past 40 years. And that, yes, over the last 2 decades, the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets have been melting and glaciers have receded in most parts of the world. That's the science. And there are a variety of important recommendations from the top minds in the country on this issue. And despite the clear and unified voice from the scientific community on this issue, the administration has continued to propose drastic cuts to climate research funding and to make remarks that are blatantly false. Just this week, the president claimed that the noise of wind turbines causes cancer. And while that may be funny to some, these kind of claims are dangerous. When we ignore facts, when we ignore science, we ignore the duty that we have to future generations. And the good news is that this generation is paying attention. Almost every meeting I've had with young people since taking office 3 months ago has been about the environment. Last month, like my colleague Representative Huffman, I joined young people in my state, in Boulder, in the youth climate strike, including folks from the Climate Reality Campus Corps at CU Boulder, Defend Our Future, many other groups, and it was incredibly encouraging to see so many young people demanding action. And on that note, I would be remiss if I didn't also recognize that as one of the original co-sponsors on the Green New Deal, there is a group of young people that really have inspired the country and certainly have inspired many of my colleagues, the Sunrise Movement, that have pushed for significant action to move the needle against climate change by pushing for the Green New Deal. At the end of the day, like many of my colleagues here, I am a parent. My wife and I have a 7-month-old daughter, Natalie. And as we think about the future that she is going to inherit, so much of the work we do here in Congress, I see through the prism of being a young father and making sure that she inherits a world that's perhaps better than the one that I inherited. And the good news, again, is that when my daughter is my age, you all will be the leaders running for office, serving in Congress, sitting in these chairs, making these decisions. And I have no doubt that given that reality, we will truly make progress on this important issue. So with that, I will ask a question of Ms. Zhang, similar to the question the Assistant Speaker Lujan mentioned. I was struck by your testimony, your written testimony, accounting your work, helping out folks in the Flint water crisis in Michigan. And I am wondering if you could share with the committee how that experience changed the way you thought about the moral implications of how environmental justice issues impact communities, and in particular communities of color.
Thank you for your question. I think that before the Flint water crisis happened, when I was in university, I was studying environmental issues, but studying them from an ecological perspective and caring about creation. But I did not realize that climate change was already impacting what Jesus calls the least of these people who were being impacted, and not only in the Flint water crisis, but there is a zip code in my district, 48217 in Detroit, where people are living within 10 miles of toxic pollution plants, and they are 60% of them are people of color, and most of them are in poverty. And I think of the recent EPA rollback of the MATS rule, and I think that 100% of their livelihoods are in danger because of this. And this happens often all over the country. And this is a deep issue of environmental justice, very much so. And we care both about creation and about people. And this climate change issue affects both drastically. So thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Back.
Mr. Carter, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to be recognized. And if I may, could I yield time to my colleague, Mr. Palmer?
The gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman. I want to ask unanimous consent to enter a couple of things into the record. One is the IPCC's climate change fiscal science basis. And just want to point out that what they found in this report, there's no robust trends in annual numbers of tropical storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes counts that have been identified over the last 100 years in the North Atlantic Basin. A couple other points that I think will be relevant to some of the comments from my colleagues. And the other is from the Climate Science Special Report from the 4th National Climate Assessment that says that the IPCC AR5, the annual report, 5th annual report, did not attribute changes in flooding to anthropomorphic influence nor report detectable changes in flooding magnitude, duration, or frequency, and would like unanimous consent to enter that into the record. And with that, I yield back to the gentleman from Georgia.
And Madam Chair, just for clarification, we're entering the entire reports into the record, right? Not select schedules that may tell partial stories.
I'm entering the pages from the annual report.
Yeah,
if the gentleman would like to read the entire report.
I would just suggest we enter the whole report. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want any misleading partial sections. I wouldn't want Bob Barr redacting it. I'd like to see the whole report.
Well, you certainly have the you can object to the unanimous consent if you want to, or you can enter the entire report on your behalf. But I'm entering those.
Either way, I'll defer to my colleague whichever way he wants to go. If he would like to enter the partial sections of the report, I would propose we additionally enter the entire report.
So without objection, we will accept Mr. Palmer's unanimous consent request and recognize. We'll go ahead to Mr. Carter and then come back to Mr. Huffman.
Okay, well, thank you, and reclaiming my time. First of all, let me thank all of you for being here, and I mean that sincerely. We appreciate your interest in this. This is encouraging to have all of you here and testifying on such a important subject. It is important. Climate change is real. Our climate has been changing since day one, and protecting our environment is real. We understand that, and that's what we want to do here. I'm going to start with you, Ms. Cooper, and ask you for for a number of reasons, not the least of which is because I have a grandchild that lives right near Tulane, and I noticed that's where you went to school, so obviously very important to me. I just wanted to ask you, you're a recent college graduate, from what I understand?
Yes, sir, I am.
And you graduated from Tulane?
Yes.
I'm just interested in knowing what spurred your interest in climate change. Was it your studies at the university, or was it the impact that perhaps the climate's had in Louisiana, or just what exactly was the impetus there?
Mm-hmm. So I've always been very interested in the outdoors. I grew up with two brothers, and our lives were digging holes and mud fights. And that kind of was my background. And then when Hurricane Katrina hit, I wasn't entirely sure of what the implications were because I was at such a young age in just 4th or 5th grade. But just seeing how that affected my community and members around me, I think has had a lasting impression on me far beyond that time when I was that age. And so when I went to Tulane University, I got invested in the Tulane Green Club, and then I got invested in a local nonprofit, and that really opened my eyes to the issues that we were facing in just that one city. And I knew that if New Orleans was having such strong implications of climate change, how much more our coast, and then how much more our nation and world aside from that.
Well, certainly New Orleans is an interesting situation. 30% of all the wetlands combined with the offshore production, energy production that they have. So I think it's an interesting example, if you will, of what's happening out there and what we could be doing and what we're doing right, what we could do better. I just wanted to ask you about some of the work in the governor's office has done to partner with the private sector and the energy companies to help improve our climate. Are you aware of anything like that?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of our partnership, as I mentioned before, a lot of our revenue comes from the offshore as well as onshore drilling
Right.
in Louisiana. And I see this as a perfect partnership because we could not do the restoration at the scale we do without this. We've completed 111 projects already. We have 76 more on the way on our coast, and this could not be possible without utilizing the resources that are already there and knowing the impact that it's having on our area.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, Ms. Cooper, and thank all of you again for being here and for your input and for your participation. It is so encouraging to see youth participating in the process, and I want you to know how much we appreciate this. And thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Mr. Huffman.
Thanks,
for
Madam Chair.
unanimous.
I would just like to request unanimous consent to enter 3 reports in their entirety into the record. The first would be the entire IPCC report, including its very explicit conclusions about anthropomorphic climate change. The second would be the recent National Climate Assessment, the 4th National Climate Assessment, including its conclusions that by the end of the century, we are likely to experience literally hundreds of billions of dollars in economic damage per year if we don't make major changes. And finally, a March 28, 2019 report by the World Meteorological Organization that also makes clear the impacts of anthropomorphic climate change, including the impacts of extreme weather.
Without objection, those are entered into the record. I would also like to note, I did have an opportunity to glance at Mr. Palmer's request here, and while it talks about the trends in the number of tropical storms, hurricanes, major hurricane counts, I can tell you as a Floridian that's lived through the past few years that yes, the number may not be impacted, but the intensity, the size, the amount of moisture in the atmosphere when you're talking about flooding, those are at issues. And those are going to be some of the issues that we address here going forward. I want to thank you all for being here, for being the voice of this generation. We hear you. It is now our obligation, our moral responsibility to take action. That is the charge of this select committee. From this point forward, we will be focused on solutions. This will be a solutions-oriented committee, and that includes a just transition, making sure we're on track to create the clean energy jobs of the future, We need everyone's help, all Americans, to develop the patriotic solutions for this country, for our planet going forward. So thank you all. Mr. Ranking Member, did you have one?
I do. Madam Chair, I want to ask unanimous consent that we include for the record a statement by Mr. Benji Backer, President of the ACC, in the record of the hearing. And just to ensure that nothing's left out and in the lines of Mr. Huffman's wishes, I want to ask if you could insert the Encyclopedia Britannica 2019 version into the record as well. So I withdraw my last request, but
thank you. Thank you all for joining our kickoff hearing for the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. We'll look forward to seeing you at the next hearing. The committee is adjourned.